For over 600 years, it has defied logic, science, and time itself. A simple linen cloth, no jewels, no gold, just an ancient burial shroud with the faint image of a crucified man scorched into its fibers. But what if everything we thought we knew about this relic was wrong? Because now, for the first time in history, artificial intelligence has been turned loose on the most controversial artifact of Christianity, the Shroud of Turin, and what it found has left even the most skeptical scientists completely stunned. This isn't mythology. This isn't blind faith. This is raw, unfiltered data, decoded not by monks or mystics, but by a machine trained on millions of forensic, historical, and anatomical data sets. And what it reveals may upend everything from biblical history to modern physics. Forget everything you've heard about the shroud being a medieval hoax. That theory just got torched. This time, the image isn't being examined by the naked eye. It's being read by intelligence that sees everything, like subscribe and buckle in, because this is where the real story begins. It wasn't displayed in a golden temple or guarded by papal armies. The shroud appeared quietly, almost anonymously, in the small French town of Lyre in the 1350s. Just over 14 feet long and 3.5 feet wide, it looked like little more than an old sheet. But then people started noticing something strange, a faint, almost ghostly image of a man, crucified, beaten, lifeless. His hands crossed, his feet pierced, and his back shredded with wounds that mirrored the Roman scourging whips of antiquity. It wasn't painted, it wasn't drawn. There was no ink, no dye, no brushstrokes. It was just there. An image somehow inside the cloth, not on it. Centuries passed with whispers and debates, but nothing exploded until one moment in 1898. A lawyer and amateur photographer named Secondo Pia took the first ever photograph of the shroud. When he developed the negative, he recoiled in shock, because what emerged wasn't a vague, blotchy outline. It was a stunningly clear image of a man's body, three-dimensional, anatomically perfect, every wound, every bloodstain, every bruise made visible in haunting detail. This wasn't just an image, it was a photographic negative, centuries before photography even existed. Scientists swarmed, artists analyzed, radiologists examined, and no one could explain how a cloth from the 1300s could contain an image that behaves more like a modern X-ray than any known painting technique. There were no signs of pigment under a microscope, no inconsistencies in proportion. In fact, the anatomy was so precise that modern forensic experts say it mirrors the injuries inflicted during an actual Roman execution, down to the exit wounds of the nails. And that's when the first wild theories began to circulate. Some speculated the image was created by a sudden burst of radiant energy like a photographic flash of unknown origin. Others proposed it was a byproduct of intense heat or even ultraviolet radiation. But from what source? There was no known method in the Middle Ages, chemical, artistic, or natural, that could replicate the shroud's properties. Still, the skeptics fought back. They wanted hard data, something measurable. And in 1988, they got it. Or so they thought. In a high-profile carbon-14 dating test, samples were taken from the shroud and sent to 3 separate laboratories, Oxford, Zurich, and the University of Arizona. The results were conclusive, or at least they seemed to be. The cloth was dated between 1260 and 1390 AD. A medieval forgery, a brilliant hoax. Case closed. News outlets declared the mystery solved. The Vatican stepped back. Academics moved on. But within months, something felt off. Chemists and textile experts started pointing out a glaring problem. The sample used for the test may not have been original to the entire cloth. That specific corner had been handled, repaired, and even rewoven after a fire in the 1500s. And under microscopic analysis, researchers discovered interwoven cotton threads, modern ones, right where the sample was cut. In other words, the labs had tested a patched-up corner, not the actual ancient fabric. Suddenly, everything was back on the table. The carbon dating results weren't invalid, but they weren't conclusive either. Instead of resolving the mystery, the tests deepened it. because now the image had to be explained again, without the shield of, "It's just a fake." Scientists returned to the image formation, but this time new technologies were available: infrared analysis, ultraviolet fluorescence, spectroscopy. Every test came back with the same oddity: no paint, no dye, no brush strokes. Even the bloodstains were real hemoglobin, with signs of trauma-induced bilirubin, consistent with someone tortured and crucified. But still, no one could say how the image was made. That's when a team of researchers turned to artificial intelligence. Rather than rely on human interpretation, which had been biased for centuries, they fed the AI raw image data, forensic injury patterns, ancient crucifixion records, radiation mapping simulations, and high-resolution scans of the cloth's weave structure. And what came back wasn't just strange, it was impossible to ignore. The AI didn't just confirm the image wasn't man-made, it detected something else: anomalies in the fiber oxidation patterns that suggested a high-energy event, something resembling a controlled burst of light or radiation that selectively discolored the outermost fibers of the cloth without penetrating deeper. Not heat, not pigment, not acid, something else. And then came the biggest anomaly of all. The image wasn't just visible. It was encoded with 3D spatial data, meaning the brighter and darker areas of the cloth weren't random. They actually mapped to the contours of a human body in three-dimensional space. In simple terms, the shroud functions like a topographical hologram, and no medieval artist could have possibly engineered that. The AI flagged this as a non-human data pattern, something it had only seen in structured physics-based phenomena like radiation shadows or plasma burns, not artwork. What does this mean? That's exactly what we'll explore next. It began with a quiet paper from Italy in 2022, overlooked by the media but devastating to skeptics. A team used wide-angle X-ray scattering, or WAX, a technology normally reserved for nanomaterial analysis, and turned it on the shroud's linen. What they found? Microdegradation patterns impossible to fake. The fibers behaved like ancient cloth, specifically 1st century cloth. Carbon decay profiles pointed to a window between 55 and 74 AD. Even more damning, new isotope ratios of the flax matched the Levant, not France, not Italy. The linen didn't come from medieval Europe at all. And then came the blood. This wasn't paint or pigment. This was real human blood. Type A B-rare, but not unheard of. Consistent with Middle Eastern populations. And smeared in patterns no forger could invent. The wounds aligned perfectly with known Roman crucifixion techniques, down to the wrist punctures, scourge marks, and a pierced side. Art in the 14th century depicted nails in the palms. This shroud didn't. It showed anatomical accuracy no artist of that era would even think to include. The scientific community reeled. The 1988 carbon dating was being dismantled by data, one molecule at a time. Then came the most heretical idea of all, the one no peer-reviewed journal dared publish at first. That maybe the image wasn't drawn or burned or etched. Maybe it was blasted. A growing number of researchers now argue that the image could have been created by a high-energy burst, akin to a flash of radiation. Not from a machine, but from the body itself. We're talking a sudden release of billions of watts, a moment of violent transformation, an event consistent with a corpse transitioning from physical to non-physical. Some call it pseudoscience, others call it resurrection. There were no signs of decay in the blood, no putrefaction. The body hadn't stayed in contact with the linen long. The blood was there, and then it wasn't. But it left behind the impossible. No lab has ever recreated the shroud's image, not with heat, not with chemicals, not with lasers. And just when it seemed the theories couldn't get more radical, AI arrived. Researchers digitized ultra-high-resolution scans of the shroud and fed it into mid-journey and stable diffusion. But they didn't just ask for art, they gave it a prompt based on actual shroud data. Reconstruct the face from the blood, swelling, and bone alignment. Maintain injury detail, no embellishment. The result? A Semitic male in his early 30s, beard bruises, swelling beneath the eyes, nose bent from blunt trauma, blood trails across the forehead, calmness in the eyes, pain in the jawline, humanity in every pore. There was no halo, no ethereal glow, just brutal realism. It looked nothing like centuries of religious paintings, but everything like a man who'd been tortured and somehow left behind a trace more profound than death. Social media lost it. Millions reposted the AI reconstructions. Some wept, some mocked. But even skeptics had to admit there was something eerie about the face. Because the AI didn't create a fantasy, it simply revealed what was already there, and what was already there should not have existed. The image didn't stay hidden for long. Once it hit the internet, it spread like wildfire. Screens lit up across continents, timelines flooded, and forums erupted with one question: how is this even possible? Because what came out of that AI prompt wasn't some stylized divine cartoon. It was raw, real, deeply unsettling. The man on the screen had Middle Eastern features, matted hair, swelling above the brow, blood caked across his temples and side. But it wasn't the gore that silenced people, it was the expression. He looked calm, almost peaceful, as if he had seen something we hadn't, as if he knew. But AI doesn't stop when humans get uncomfortable. Prompt engineers pushed further. They asked it, what would this face look like the moment the image burned into linen? They told it, simulate the flash, the energy, the burst of something that left a photographic negative before photography even existed. And AI complied. The results were terrifyingly cinematic. Bodies suspended mid-air, arms stretched, wounds glowing. One version showed a blinding white burst from the chest. Another visualized rings of energy exploding outward from the shroud, warping the cloth into a heatwave of sacred distortion. Some dismissed it as creative flair, but others didn't. Because what startled researchers wasn't just the art, it was that the visuals looked eerily familiar, like reconstructions done decades earlier, by hand, by archaeologists and forensic experts. Same nose shape, same cheekbones, same bruising around the eyes. Somehow, AI had reverse-engineered a face that lined up with blood stains, with anatomical data, with Roman torture protocols, without ever knowing what it was looking at. But the backlash came fast. Experts cautioned, Midjourney is trained on billions of online images, icons, Renaissance paintings, movie stills, and yes, thousands of sanitized Jesus with blue eyes and golden robes. This wasn't revelation. This was a remix. They called it aesthetic hallucination, a mirror of our collective imagination. But then, something strange. The AI hadn't produced the common Western Jesus. It didn't look like Da Vinci's or Sunday school coloring books. It looked Semitic, olive-skinned, scarred, first-century accurate. It looked right. And that left even the critics scratching their heads. Because no matter how much they tried to write it off, the image felt authentic, not holy, not mythologized, just real. That's when the forensic scientists came back into the picture. They weren't interested in the face. They were obsessed with the body, the angles of the wrists, the flow of blood from the scalp, the way the wounds curled around the shoulder blades. All of it bizarrely correct. They zoomed into the image, past the blur, into the shadows. They noticed the blood didn't pool as it would on a flat surface. It trickled, following gravity, as if the man was upright during the flow, then laid down after death. That level of anatomical accuracy shouldn't exist in a painting. Not in the 1300s, not even close. And yet, no pigment, no paintbrush bristles, no fingerprint oils, no pressure indentations. The image had no depth. It was embedded into the top 200 nanometers of the linen, less than the thickness of a human hair. Not scorched, not dyed, almost like it had been flashed in. A team from the University of Padua called it a photonic projection. Others said it was radiation, similar to what happens inside particle accelerators. One bold physicist compared it to a nuclear afterimage, but there was still the biggest question of all. Why is there no decomposition? The blood is there, coagulated, clotted, iron-rich, confirmed type AB. But there are no signs of decay, no fluid leakage, no tissue breakdown. The man bled. But then, nothing. As if the body vanished. A chemical impossibility, a forensic paradox. One researcher put it this way: if this is a fake, it's the most biologically perfect hoax in human history. And then came the fracture. Because up until now, this had been a debate of science. Art versus artifact. Real versus fake. But the image was starting to step outside those categories. People weren't just asking how anymore, they were asking why. Why would someone go through the trouble of creating something so technically advanced it couldn't be replicated today? Why encode forensic detail that wouldn't even be discoverable until the invention of scanning electron microscopes? Why match it so closely to a crucifixion method that hadn't been practiced in nearly 2,000 years? There was no payoff, no auction, no profit. The shroud was never sold, never paraded around for money, it just existed. Passed from hand to trembling hand, hidden, protected, buried, burned, rescued, and now digitized. And somehow, the deeper we scan, the stranger it gets. Not one layer of paint, not one drop of ink, just blood, cloth, and light. In 2025, the Vatican did something no one expected. Without fanfare, they projected a high-resolution scan of the Shroud of Turin in a digital exhibition in the heart of Turin Cathedral. It wasn't the original cloth, it wasn't even a replica. It was pixels, enhanced, enlarged, sharpened, every fiber visible, every stain vivid. And right next to it, on people's smartphones and public screens, was the AI-generated face. The face reconstructed not by artists, monks, or historians, but by algorithms. Visitors compared the two in real time. One was static linen, the other living data. And yet something connected them. People stared, some wept, some whispered prayers, others just stood silent, unsure what they were seeing. The old relic and the new rendering weren't just images, they were a mirror. One framed in faith, the other framed in code. And in between? A sensation no one could name, not science, not faith, something else. The Vatican didn't endorse the AI result. They didn't need to. The internet had already done that. The image spread like wildfire. Debates reignited. Was this the face of Christ, or a collective projection of longing, grief, and myth filtered through a machine? But no matter where you stood, the reaction was the same. No one looked away. Because AI didn't answer the mystery, it rewired it, made it more haunting, more intimate. It stripped away the gold halos and medieval frames. It gave us blood, bone, and sorrow. It didn't explain the resurrection. It didn't try. Instead, it asked the question in a new voice. What if this isn't proof of a miracle, but evidence of something we don't have a word for yet? Forensic science tried. Carbon dating tried. Historians tried. Artists tried. Now AI tried. And still the cloth refuses to confess. Its silence has become louder with every test, every scan, every reconstruction. Because what if resurrection isn't a story, but a phenomenon? What if the shroud isn't proof of divinity or deception, but a record of a moment so rare, so violent, so luminous that even machines can't explain it? Even skeptics are split. Some still hold to the 1988 carbon test. Others quietly admit those samples were contaminated. Too many variables, too many flaws. The most recent tests point back to the 1st century. The wounds match, the blood is real. The isotope footprint matches the ancient Levant. And the image? No brushstrokes, no paint, no pigment, too shallow to be painted, too complex to be imagined. So what encoded it? One physicist called it a snapshot of radiation. Another called it a relic of the impossible. But the most chilling theory, it came not from science, but from a forensic imaging expert. He said, the image looks like what you'd see if a body vanished in a burst of light. It's not art, it's evidence. That's what the AI saw. That's what it turned into pixels. It didn't know, but it saw. It visualized trauma, scars, serenity. It saw a man brutally executed, but not destroyed. And that's the question that won't die. Not because it's a miracle, not because it's fake, but because even now, in an age of supercomputers and quantum imaging, no one can explain it. What happened in that tomb? What flash of energy left an imprint so precise, so permanent, that it's still readable 2,000 years later? And why, despite all our progress, do we still feel chills looking at it? Maybe we haven't solved the mystery. Maybe we've just joined it. Because in the end, the Shroud of Turin didn't need AI to prove anything. But the moment AI looked into it, something stared back. And that changes everything.